Meanwhile, we've got an update to a story we told you about just a couple of hours ago when we told you the White House wanted the United States Navy to move the warship, the USS John S. McCain, out of sight ahead of President Trump's visit to Japan. That was according to an email reviewed by the Wall Street Journal. Well, now we have it. A May 15th email sent to U.S. Navy and Air Force officials obtained by CNBC. It outlines plans for Trump's arrival from conversations between the White House Military Office and the 7th Fleet of the U.S. Navy, which included the instruction the USS John McCain needs to be out of sight. Photos reviewed by the Journal showed a tarp hung over the ship's name ahead of Trump's visit. Sailors reportedly were directed to remove any coverings from the ship that bore its name. Later, the tarp was removed and a barge was moved closer to the ship, it's claimed, and sailors who wear caps bearing that name were given the day off. That's according to people familiar with the matter. Meanwhile, the New York Times reports this, quote, McCain sailors were not invited to hear Trump speak that day aboard the amphibious assault ship Wasp, while sailors from other American warships at the base were. That, according to 2 Navy sailors who spoke on the condition of anonymity because they were not authorized to speak publicly. In a statement this morning, Acting Defense Secretary Pat Shanahan said this: I never authorized any action around the movement or activity regarding that ship. Furthermore, I would never dishonor the memory of a great American patriot like Senator McCain. I would never disrespect the young men and women who crew that ship. For his part, President Trump tweeted last night, quote, he was not informed about anything having to do with the ship. Naval officials insist they did not hide or obscure the ship, saying in part the picture of the tarp is from Friday and it was taken down on Saturday. All ships remained in normal configuration during the president's visit. Mike, we talked about this earlier in the show. We now at CNBC have the email that shows the White House asking the 7th Fleet to effectively hide and obscure the USS John S. McCain, named for McCain's grandfather first, who was an admiral during World War II, then for his father, who was an admiral in Vietnam, and then for Senator McCain himself, because Donald Trump doesn't like the guy.
Yeah, and with all due respect to Ari Melber, who is a lawyer, I'm not a lawyer, in the case of the United States population, the public, the voters of the United States, in the case of them versus the stability of this president of the United States, of his narcissism, of his inadequate sense of his own character, of what he has done each and every day to institutions, with this email from the White House to the Pentagon urging the removal of the USS John McCain's name out there in Japan, the prosecution now rests.
And Mike, to break it down a little further, just imagine if you're one of those sailors who's deployed on the USS McCain and you're away from your family, you're living on a warship, and the commander-in-chief, who is your ultimate boss, shows up. You don't get to go to the event with the commander-in-chief.
It's beyond. I mean, you've worked in our foreign policy teams. You've worked with the military. I wouldn't say it's my area of expertise, but any person looks at this story, Willie, and you think we have these honors for soldiers who served, as you just outlined, and the notion that there were people here requesting to hide that honor, it cuts against it. And so it is one of these things that just grabs a hold of you and says, what is broken? What is broken in the process that someone is trying?
Or in this individual.
Right, as you put it, in the individual, that someone is trying to potentially dishonor that which has been formally decreed through the military, through the government, through the way the Senate and the House name things and do all of that, to, as you said it, Mike, to deal with somebody's insecurities.
The president himself this morning has said again that he knew nothing about this, but we were talking earlier. It's reflective of the fear that has been installed in that White House, where people around him, in the highest levels, are afraid of upsetting him, and knowing how he will react to this, whether it's about John McCain or about the Russia probe, which is why it is so stunning that today, for the first time, he seems to acknowledge that Russia helped him, because that's a subject he won't even address in the White House. People around him are told not to talk about it.
A lot of people listen to this show in the radio in the car. I just want to read what the email says that CNBC has now obtained. This is a list of requests from the White House House. Number 3 on that list is USS John McCain needs to be out of sight. Later it says, confirm number 3 will be satisfied. As someone who's worked in the government, Elise, can you imagine ever drafting that line?
Absolutely not. And I am concerned that within the military chain of command, they went along with it too. I remember within the Bush White House, we would have these, video conferences once every week, maybe every couple of days, when we were during the Iraq War and the Iraq War surge messaging, and we would be communicating with the embassy in Baghdad, with Petraeus's spokesperson, and there was such a fine line of the political and the military and the basic job of communicating to the American public. And I remember Petraeus's spokesman was so careful about that line. And before he was coming to testify to Congress, he was like, well, that's, and that's all we can say about that. Of course, we're not going to say anything about what the general will be testifying, and you'll be given no heads up. And that's why it's shocking to me that the institution that I have always admired for staying apolitical was brought down by the narcissism of the commander at top.
I mean, this is all because a former war hero, a former United States senator, the nominee of President Trump's adopted political party for president, did not genuflect appropriately to Donald Trump over the years. Ari Melber will be watching The Beat at 6 p.m. Eastern here on MSNBC.
Thank you, sir.
Great to see you. We'll see you later tonight. Casey Hunt and Yamiche Alcindor, thank you both for your reporting as always. Still ahead on Morning Joe, President Trump speaking, as we said, right now to reporters on the heels of Robert Mueller's public remarks yesterday. We'll have the president's new comments. Plus, Montana governor and 2020 presidential candidate Steve Bullock is standing by. He joins our conversation next on Morning Joe.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.